This afternoon we're in the office of Miss Susan Turner, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to ask you about osteopathy, and I would like to thank you very much for this.
I'm honored to be with you.
Miss Susan Turner is a 1979 graduate from the European School of Osteopathy. Miss Turner, why become an osteopath?
Ooh. Well, I had a very strong flash when I was 14 that I wanted to do something to do with healing or medicine. And I actually ended up taking an English literature degree at Edinburgh University. But somehow this something was always tapping at my shoulder somehow, that I wouldn't really be happy until I was working with my hands and in some kind of healing way. And I heard about osteopathy first when I was sitting in the coffee room of Edinburgh University. I spent a lot of time in there, more than in the library. And a boy who is still a very good friend, who I didn't know very well then, was talking to somebody and telling her that in his summer holidays he'd had apparently appendicitis, but that he'd gone to the family osteopath who cared for them when they were children in Suffolk, called Mr. Barker, who was a cranial osteopath, I heard him saying. And Mr. Barker had said to him, you haven't got appendicitis, you've got a problem in your lumbar spine that I'm going to correct, so that the source, the neural source of the apparent appendicitis will be able to settle down. And he had an operation booked in the local hospital, which was then cancelled. And he was fine. And I was so taken with this, my ears pricked up on this conversation that wasn't really mine, and it just stayed in my mind. And obviously I got to know him later and had a chance to ask him more about it. And then in my 20s I did all kinds of things, arts and teaching and different kinds of things. But I came to a point where I felt that it had been interesting, but that I'd been, in a way, if you like, moving on the waves of fate, and I wasn't on the deep current of destiny. And I remember I stood in my kitchen and I made a heartfelt prayer that I might find work, or a path of work through which I could be useful, but at the same time carry on learning all through my life. And then 3 days later, precisely, I was in having a treatment with Mr. Tom Dummer, who I think you've heard of. Yeah.
Yes.
And he said to me, it's the third time you've come and your spine isn't improving. Is there something on your mind that's holding you back? And I said, yes, I really want to find the work I want to do, and I would like to do osteopathy, but I've already done a degree and I've done a teaching training, and I can't see my way to finding my way through another course. And he said, well, actually we've just opened up a new course in Maidstone, which is a full-time course in terms of hours, but it's concentrated into 3 very long days for the first 2 years, and then 4 long days in the clinical stage in the last 2 years. And it was like that was like the answer. And then I kept trying to escape from this. There were 8 coincidences that followed that, because I thought, oh, studying again, 4 years, oh. But actually, this life kept tapping me on the shoulder again, and in the end I found some very interesting work to support my way through college, because I, in the evenings, in the weekend, I did waitressing for a very interesting person who was actually the niece of G.I. Gurdjieff, who was called Luba, and I also taught in Holloway Prison part-time, and that was very interesting. So,
what did you teach in prison?
Maths and biology, but one summer holidays it was Scottish country dancing, reflexology, art, but mostly it was maths and biology.
You know, it's an exact number when you say that when I was 14 I had a flash and knew that I wanted to go into medicine or osteopathy. Can I ask you what happened when you were 14?
Well, it felt like a bit of bolt of lightning. Actually, what happened was I was at school and we were talking about Africa and some of the problems in the African countries. And somebody said, but what they really need is doctors. And I suddenly found myself saying, I'm going to be a doctor. But I went to a school where it was pretty impossible to be a doctor and get the level of science that you needed for medical school, and you needed less for osteopathy. And so I did do science A-levels, because I went to a sixth form college from there. I did botany and zoology, but my physics and chemistry was behind because I'd started so late. So I after that I lived in France for 6 months and learnt and improved my French, and I did voluntary service overseas, which is like English Peace Corps, in Nigeria for a year, and then I did an arts degree. But I had a feeling I wasn't quite kind of on track.
When did you know this about yourself? I mean, did you know before you were 14, or did you know at a very early age that you wanted to be involved with helping people in a deep way? Maybe not thinking of the idea of medicine or osteopathy.
No, I didn't know, but I was always concerned at quite a young age about what I would do when I was an adult, from the age of about 5. I mean, I went through being a farmer to, this and that. I was very concerned about, I felt there was something I wanted to do that would sort of use what I had in me, but I didn't know what it was till then.
This next question I have changed from when I've asked it in the States to when I've asked it here. In the States, osteopathy, as you know, is medicalized, and very few, I would say probably, some people might argue the statistics, but probably less than 1 or 2% are doing a manipulative practice as part of their day. Certainly everyone here in the UK, if you did not want to do manipulation or put your hands on people, you've really made a large mistake becoming an osteopath. But having said that, did you see that when you became an osteopath, or when you came out of school, did you think, I'm going to be a manipulator and I'm going to work on problems in this way? Or did you just think, or did you have a different view of what it meant to be an osteopath?
Different from,
did you have a view, I'm going to be someone who manipulates back pain and neck pain, or I'm going to be someone who treats people with problems?
Well, at the ESO, the ethos was very much about total physiology. It wasn't just about back pain. There was a big emphasis on body mechanics and looking at the balance of the spine, and John Wernham's way of thinking, that the spine has to be in balance and the curves in balance and all that. So there was a strong mechanical emphasis, but it was as part of the physiological loop. So we studied Kim Kaur's work and the facilitated segment and all that kind of thing, and thought about ways of defacilitating the sphere of influence and viscerosomatic, somatico-visceral areas of the spine. And I think the teachers there at the time, Harold Klug, Robert Lever, Tom Dummer, very much saw it as the whole person. And I always felt that what I wanted to do was work with the whole person. And there was, in the third and fourth year when I was working in the college clinic, I felt I didn't really know what I was doing at all. I didn't feel confident. But what I would say over and over again as I worked was that your hidden self becomes strong. So somehow I saw the body as an avenue to the embodiment of a person's fullness, that their potential might be fulfilled through the vehicle being right. And as you know, John Wernham trained with Little John. Little John came from the tradition of thinking of physiology first, even before anatomy. I mean, anatomy and physiology in the way Still talked are kind of the same thing. But he would read from Little John's notes, and actually Little John didn't see osteopathy stopping at anything. His notes even tell you how to treat rabies. Well, so I kind of left osteopathic school with a kind of split between thinking osteopathy can do anything, but at the same time feeling very small in my own abilities, which I suppose one would really, if you sort of set yourself the standard of being able to treat anything with osteopathy, you would feel a bit small. But it meant that because this idea was around, though in some cases unrealistic and needing more emphasis about how one would cooperate with orthodox medicine and other professionals, it did mean that always one was thinking about, well, if a person comes in with a particular symptom, how is this related to the way the body is balanced? What's the way in from what I see in the body to do with areas that are irritated, areas that are decompensated, areas that are struggling? What's the way in to how that relates to physiology? And also, what part is how they feel about their life and themselves within that body interplaying with this loop? Because before I got into osteopathy, I was very interested in Jungian psychology. And one of the things I did was, with 3 friends and an ancient psychoanalyst in her early 90s, we started a place called the Salisbury Centre in Edinburgh, which is still going. And the aim was to bring together the spiritual aspect, meditation, the psychological aspect, working on dreams in a Jungian type way, in groups, and handicrafts, because I was interested in pottery at the time, and other people were weaving and painting. So there was this sense then of the kind of integration of body, soul and spirit. And so in the Still tradition of man is triune. That was the way I came into osteopathy, really. Well, that was the way I approached it.
That's a great answer. I'm hesitating a little bit because I'm thinking as I'm listening. It's a great answer. Thinking about what you're saying.
Yeah.
Many people have talked about the concept of a key lesion.
Yes.
And I've heard it in different contexts and meaning different things to different people.
Yes.
Is that a concept that's useful for you, or?
Well, that was a concept that was very much in our training from Tom Dummer, who he called it the primary lesion. I confess that he worked with something called specific adjusting, where you try and find the key lesion for that time, that moment in time, and address that one and hope that the rest of the body would orientate around it. And I confess I'm not very good at that. The way I work, I feel around first from the feet, because I'm long-sighted, so I like to get a longer way view at somehow where how the body breathes and where doesn't breathe, and where might be restricted, and where, and the way it all kind of works together. And I try to find the area which holds everything else. But very often, I'm almost at the end of the treatment before I find it. And I admire the people who, Robert Lever is very good in that way. He worked closely with Tom Dummer, and others like him, Jez Lamb, and Stuart Korth. They just sense where it is and go to it. I work my way around it and sort of come up around it until somehow it emerges from the inside. So yes, I think I don't know if I think there's a particular key lesion in every case. Do you mean the maintaining factor that holds everything else?
I mean it. Excuse me. I mean it as whatever it might mean to you. Some people would talk about a key lesion as far as being a key physical aspect, or a key lesion. Fulford often talked about, your key lesion could have been emotional, it could have been spiritual, and that means different things to different people.
Yes.
So maybe a better term is just say the important lesion, or what becomes important to you. Would you consider that, well, let me rearrange this. Would you consider that people's big problem or key problem could be physical or emotional?
Yes.
Could it be something else that people call spiritual?
Yes, I think so.
What does that mean to you?
What do the words emotional and spiritual mean?
Yes.
I think I'd have to think about how to phrase that, because it's one feels things in a treatment. One's whole body becomes a diagnostic instrument, and I find my body mirrors sometimes the pains and strains. And I'm not afraid of that, because early in my professional life I realized that if something arrived suddenly, if a sensation arrived suddenly and wasn't in my continuum, that it was likely to be from the patient. And if I said to my body, all my emotions, thank you for telling me, I know this is not me, then it would go. So I never worry about this thing about picking up symptoms from patients, because I just think it's good information, and when it's acknowledged it doesn't need to hang around. So it's quite difficult, but it's quite difficult to put into words about these levels. I find that I'm digressing a little from your question.
That's fine.
But I find the same mirroring happens on an emotional level. I might suddenly feel a sadness or a sensation or an impression of a kind of internal physical posture that I associate with an inner emotional stance. It might be suddenly I feel as if the patient's doing this. They're not actually on the outside, but something on the inside is going like this, or like this, or there's a kind of a hint of something that I associate with an inner emotional stance or pattern. And if I work with that on the physical level, at the same time as acknowledging the inner position, and hold that inner position in a non-judgmental way, and not trying to avoid it if it's painful, if it reminds me of pain. Like I used to have a phrase, don't avert your face, just stay there, and somehow be present to hold what might be difficult for the patient to hold alone. But if you're holding it with them and not being afraid of it, maybe something in the patient then cannot be afraid of it too, and let go of it. And I think there's as above, so below. The way Dr. Still worked, as I understand, and the way Dr. Sutherland worked in the main was, as Sutherland describes, the gentle exaggeration of the lesion to the point of balance. So on a physical level, osteopathy is kind of homeopathic, where you're taking that strain pattern and you're allowing it to move where it naturally moves, into the position that fully expresses the lesion. And in that full expression of the lesion, somehow it starts to manifest all the components that went into that strain pattern. And so you're saying to it, I'm not trying to change you, I'm going to support you in the way you are, so that if I support your strain pattern, you don't have to hold it yourself anymore. So the bigger half of the equation, which is the body's ability to heal itself, is then free to act. So when the tissues have explored for their balance point, their full expression of the lesion, somehow in that support and matching of force vectors, matching of compressions, if it's all gathered there in a neutral field of total acceptance and non-judgment, non-fear, it's something like, on a physical level, something in the innate intelligence of the body is able to see itself in the mirror of what it is, and then remember. And it remembers, an interesting word. It's like remember, the members of the limbs. It's like it recalls what its pattern of health is, that it knew in the geometry of the embryo. And so there's an analogue on the emotional level too, that if we take the patient just as we would like to be taken ourselves, just as we are, without trying to change anything, and the emotions respond similar to the way I've described the body responding, and one can hold it in the same way. I think as far as... Well, I'm just going to say more about the emotions that I find, particularly the sternum. The sternum very much expresses. I do a lot of work along the sternum, along the sterni brie. Of course, there are internal attachments to the pericardium. But on a spiritual level, well, I'm not sure how I would describe spiritual level, and perhaps it means different things at different times, because there isn't any end to what is spiritual, because there isn't any end to the depth of what we call spiritual, but the part that I can access is something. If there were a strain on that level, it would be something to do with a mismatch between what the person's able to resonate with or manifest in their lives and what their original, the original intention of their life impulse was or is deep down. And in that I'm very grateful to Dr. James Jealous for alerting us all to the presence of the archetype of the embryo. As when he first pointed out to me the significance of the notochord, that was very helpful, because if the notochord is the first line that imprints itself on the embryonic plate, it's the first sense of midline in the fluids of the very fluid, malleable nature of the embryonic plate. To me, that first insignia of the embryo has behind it all that we carry in our consciousness from a universal awareness and of what our place is in the totality of things for this life. And on a physical level, it inducts the development of the neural tube, it inducts metameric segmentation. It has a lot to do with the organisation of the development of the whole body. So if I what I try to hold a person in that place, I acknowledge the presence of the notochord, and I think of it as a line of light 1 cell thick that is like Janus. It looks forward into life and it looks back to its context in eternity. And if I just feel for the space that the person wants to be held in, do they want to be held as if they belong with the stars or the horizon, or just as if they end at their skin? Wherever they want to be held, to somehow ask the question of whether what's being manifested in the body and in life is comfortable with whatever that original impulse and meaning was. Are they living their meaning? And it's not for me to actually do anything on that level, but just offer somehow that question and hold that space and see what they want to do with it, non-verbally. I don't normally talk about it.
That's a beautiful explanation. It really was. Truly. Let me give you an easier question.
Okay.
Easier to explain, perhaps. The patient's chief complaints that they come in with.
Yes.
My back hurts, my neck hurts.
Yeah.
Whatnot. How relevant is that in what may or may not happen in their session with you? What do you do with that information?
Well, I know there are osteopaths who say that we don't treat lesions. But actually, I think if somebody has a chief concern, that has to be my chief concern too. Whatever else is going on, sometimes pains in a particular part of the body can be a red herring, because sometimes you find that, and this is something that Tom Dummer emphasized a lot, that what manifests in one part of the body may originate in another, and for instance, you can get, I've found lower back pain or sort of a sacroiliac pain to have its origin, maybe this is your question about key lesions, have its origin in a a dental implant in which the post was created a force vector up into the maxilla, locked up the ethmoid, this is the way it appeared to me, it locked up the anterior falx, and then the other end of the reciprocal tension membrane at the sacrum was swinging around because it was working around a fixed fulcrum up here. And so the pain was manifesting at the sacroiliac. And sometimes in whiplashes, the pain can be in the neck, but the holding factor can be in the impaction of the sacrum. For example, the pain could be in the neck, or left-sided headaches might be because the pericardium is manifesting, is responding to emotional stress and creating fascial drag. So yes, I have to make the patient's chief concern my chief concern, but then be a Sherlock Holmes and track why that's there, and maybe treat elsewhere, or acknowledge other levels of, or engage with the history. Stuart Korth, who I know you're going to see later, used to have a phrase that the etiology, once you find the etiology, then the treatment works of itself. So we're very fortunate when we, find the cause, be it in present or past time. Because that's another situation where the body, the system, the person, once it feels seen and known, then somehow it's able to, and it's the forces of that, the forces that are held there are matched and supported, then it's able to let it go and rework according to its innate embryonic organisation.
You've told me some of the people that inspired you when you were a student.
Mm.
Could you elaborate on that? Mr. Dummer, you talked about.
Yes.
Off camera before, you had said some very interesting things about Becker.
Yes. Well, I did have difficulty in my first 3 years of osteopathic school with structural manipulative work, and that fell into place at the end of my third year, when I was exposed to cranial osteopathy for the first time. Somehow, when I was introduced to that concept, then I was able to learn the rest and manipulate or whatever without difficulty. And in fact, Harold Klug, who was one of the teachers, who is a very interesting osteopath, but he's in New Zealand. You'll have a long way to go. He'd invited John Upledger to come and do a course for the Society of Osteopaths, as it was then, because we weren't yet embraced by the BSO course. And when that, in that course, I just thought, yes, this is what it is. And of course, I had heard of osteopathy originally with reference to cranial osteopathy, because L.G. Barker was that character, the osteopath I told you about initially. I think when I was at osteopathic school, though, I think I didn't quite find, I had to work to find my track for a long time after I qualified, because people there gave me specific gifts, but I had to find my own track, and I suppose everybody does. You know, we've been told to dig on, haven't we? I suppose John Wernham gave me confidence that you don't ever have to be afraid of taking a patient on whatever they complain of, because there is always a relationship with what you find and what's going on. And so there is always a way to, in some way, access their physiology. I think, as I said, Tom Dummer taught specific adjusting and of always finding the key lesion, and I mentioned that I didn't think I was very good at going straight for that one thing. So I've never had the skill that, in that particular way, that people who've studied with him closely and in a postgraduate way did. But Tom Dummer was a Tibetan Buddhist, and the thing that he gave me, which fitted very much with the way I was travelling inwardly at the time, was that where you put your consciousness, that's where your touch and your hands, those forces will direct themselves there. And actually Anne Wales later on talked about where you direct your forces, which obviously is also about where you put your mind. I think Harold Klug was very supportive to me as a student, and he worked very much on engaging with the physical, the emotional, the spiritual level, which was very supporting to me, because that's the way I felt I wanted to work anyway, to be open to the whole person. And my colleagues, actually, when I left college, I still didn't have my confidence, and those with whom I travelled as a peer group were my teachers too. One dear friend and colleague is Peter Cockhill, who we started in practice together and shared our discoveries for a number of years, and still do, though we don't work in the same practice. And Peter Armitage, who I worked with for some years in the Osteopathic Centre for Children. And because I work now in the Sutherland Cranial College, and before that the BSO postgraduate cranial course, that team teaching that we do is a wonderful thing, because you travel together with a group of people down the years, and every time you have your pre-course meeting, people share their latest ideas. And so it's like a study group, and there's sort of you kind of get little jewels, that add each time. But you asked me about my influences at college. Shall I talk about my influences after college? Was that the next question?
Go ahead and answer whatever you like.
Well,
you had started telling about Roland Becker.
Roland Becker, yes.
And yes. Interesting.
I'd come across something Roland had written. I define potency as a functioning point of stillness in the fluctuation of the tide. And when he came over to the BSO, and I don't know what quite year it was, but it could have been about 1988. It was shortly before he stopped teaching. And I said to him, if I think of potency as a functioning point of stillness in the fluctuation of the tide, in the moving tide, I can only think of it as another dimension. And he said, yep, it's another dimension, it's the fourth dimension. And then off he went. And then I talked about this with Peter Armitage, and we thought of the fourth dimension is time, but what it actually feels like is timelessness. Timelessness, a timeless present, a timeless moment. And timelessness is like a little touch of the eternal. So that's brought me to thinking of stillness, or the still point, as the point between when one cycle finishes and a new therapeutic cycle begins, as a point when the nature of being, the deepest nature of existence has a chance to manifest in its fullness. That there's an alignment, if you like, we call it the eternal, or health, or life in its fullness as it seeks to manifest in the body. But so often the way we manifest health is subject to cause and effect from the past. But when you touch that stillness, then that sense of awesomeness, which often happens in the room before it happens in the body, there's that sense of the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual, and the deepest nature of what we are, kind of having a chance to line up. So the real pattern of what we are has a chance to come through unhindered before it, and then manifest the therapeutic cycle of motion that follows. I don't know if I've... Well, anyway, you're asking me...
Yes, you have, if you didn't know.
And then I met Bob Fulford once, and I think that on the SCTF course at the BSO we'd been studying the face, and over the other side of the lunch table he said, "I never bother about these details about the face. All I do is this," and he got full of my nose, pulled it down, pulled it to the left, pulled it to the right, and pulled it back to the centre again. And I suppose he got a point, because actually, well, yes. A lot's attached to your nose and your face. Ethmoids and zygomatic processes and lacrimal bones. And
was that the last time you asked him a question at lunch?
Well, I didn't unfortunately meet him again, but I would have been very interested to.
Ms. Turner, how would you say that you're different from people that taught you? How has osteopathy become your own?
I think we're all different, aren't we? That's what I like about osteopathy. That it's not a recipe, it's a way of thinking. And each osteopath brings everything they have to bring of their manual skills and their experience of life. So I don't think I'm any more different from any other osteopath than every osteopath is from every other one.
That's a fair answer. Do you have a thought as to why people get sick? Why they have imbalance? Whether it's physical or emotional, do you have some further away thought as to what makes them sick?
I think it would be difficult to say in a simple way. I would like to be as open as I can to the multiplicity of causes. I think Anne Wales said that people became more difficult, or somebody of her generation said people became more difficult to treat after the Second World War. I think, as I say, I do think that the inner levels of our being interact constantly with the body, and so does the body so does the physical interact with the emotional. You know, Sutherland's observation about postnatal depression following sacral sag, or the anterior lesion of the sacrum, because of the dragging on the neural tube and of the reciprocal tension membrane, which would interface with the way the pituitary is able to deliver its hormones into the body. That's just one example. The freeze that happens with a physical shock that locks up fluid interchange in the body. So illness can be somatico-psychic or psychosomatic, but in the modern world there are other stresses as well, in that society is less stable. The family holds people less, they're much more on their own, isolated in a way. And we have pollution in a different way. We have not just physical pollution and pollution of food, but we have microwave pollution. I mean, round every corner is a mobile phone mast. Leukemia is going up in the country because I don't know why, but one possibility is that there's a huge microwave pollution from the masts. There's increased electromagnetic stress. I think in the modern world there's more and more facets, both dietary and lifestyle and things we don't know about that affect us. But I suppose with that question comes another question, is how can these multifaceted effects be resolved? And I think if I was thinking it that way around, I would think, how can we, or the patient, regain our ability to rebalance? Because the things that human beings have as a species hugely is adaptability, and we have the ability to adapt to change on all levels, really. And so, rather than think of the cause of illness as the enemy, the question is, what is it in the innate self-correcting mechanism on whatever level that can integrate this and integrate these factors? If they can't be released and have got to be lived with, how can the system adapt to it, and how can I support that adaptation?
Have your inspirations, have your challenges changed throughout your career?
The challenge is also not just about the work and the delivery of what the patient wants. The challenge is, how far can I stay present to and open and aware throughout the treatment. So it's a practice of being present and being available. That's always been the challenge, really. But as far as inspirations go, when I was in 1986, Dr. James Jealous came to the BSO as a tutor, and I worked with him on a patient on a technique that he'd learnt from Ruby Day, who's his teacher, which was releasing an intraosseous strain. And I'd worked with intraosseous strains before, because you get patients who've had car accidents and they've shoved their feet on the brakes and they've got impacted right up into their their tibias, and so I'd worked in that way. But he worked like he introduced to me feeling the tidal motion breathing the bone, and the way you can see the bone as a periosteum around a bag of fluid, and that actually opened up a whole new sphere for me that I took through, and then 18 months later, in 1988, he invited me to go and spend a week with him in his practice, and that was a tremendous opening for me. And what he emphasised then is something Roland Becker emphasised, which is it's not so much the lesion that is of primary interest, it's how the body is trying to re-establish health that's of interest. Where is that potency working in the body, and how can we engage with the capacity for health even more than we engage with the strain pattern? And that set me off on a track, together with the sense of the embryo and its intelligence and the organised geometry as an organising presence within the body at any stage of life. As the memory of the innate knowledge of how to reorganise and what the innate pattern is before the whips and scorns of time come in, that is always there. And I'd actually had that from my college days, but not with the image of the embryo, which has been so helpful. And then on that same trip to work with him, he took me to Anne Wales's study group. And that was a wonderful experience. And I've been close to the members of her group ever since. And I've been back to her study group several times. And they've always been very welcoming. And then, having looked at Anne Wales's work, with the way she worked with balanced ligamentous tension in the way that Dr. Sutherland had taught her, inspired me, because what I felt had happened in England was that you get these idiotic letters in our professional journals where the rub-waggle and crack lot criticise the cranial lot, and the cranial lot are airy-fairy, and they think that the rub-waggle and crack lot are crass. So, I mean, you've got this, like, there are two osteopathies there. But what Sutherland's work, as taught by Anne, with the ligamentous articular release, it's a wonderful bridge between the two, because here is a tradition that still passed to Sutherland, in which he said, when Sutherland writes on page 112 of the old Contributions of Thought, that Dr. Still did not jerk the body. He's taken my hands under his and helped me feel the lesion as it was exaggerated, and then as the ligaments guided the bones back into place. And he said it's not the muscles, it's the ligaments that are the active agencies of correction at joints. And then he goes on to say that we can apply the same principle in the cranial sphere. But here we work not so much like a mechanic as like a watchmaker, but he implies the principle is the same. But in the cranium we have, to help us, the reciprocal tension membrane, the brain, which is the motor of respiration, and the cerebrospinal fluid. And so there you have it. They have Still, hand to hand to Sutherland, hand to hand to Anne Wales. And you have it just there, that you have the spectrum from Still to Sutherland, ligamentous articular work, which he worked with farmers, not sort of airy-fairy people, but sort of really physical people, to the cranial sphere, to this more subtle level of work. And then somehow you see the whole spectrum as one osteopathy, in which we need to try to be available to people on the level they need to be addressed, and not kind of get seduced by one end of the spectrum or the other. So I felt very strongly that this aspect, the body work, Sutherland's body work, needed to be introduced in this country. So I rang Anne up, and she was always so kind and so available, over the phone to answer questions, and so passionate about osteopathy, right till the very end. She gave her last lecture at the age of 100. And she said, I rang up and said, can any of your study group, would you recommend anybody to come and help us put on a course in the general work of Dr. Sutherland? And she said, well, I can do, but actually what you should do is you should get a video recorder, come over here, it'll take me 5 days to unload. So I said, fine, can I bring a few other people so that we can do this together and help each other to learn it? She said, fine, whoever you bring's fine. So I sort of took over a few people who were already teaching at the ESO particularly, and we put on a course, and we've done that course ever since. And I'm immensely, every time I work, I thank her for the generosity for year after year, being so available to us. And so unassuming and somehow down to earth, and yet aligned on all levels. So humble.
Dr. Sutherland and others have referenced in their writings about God and the influence of God in the healing process, or a prime mover, or nature, or any reference that you would like to make. Excuse me. How do you see your role between, or do you have a role between some sort of prime mover, the patient and their illness? Where do you fit into that?
I don't have a personalized sense of the divine, but I do have a belief in the life that breathes all things, and out of which everything arises continuously and returns moment to moment. And in a sense, I think that when Dr. Still says our purpose is not to find disease, but cure disease, but to find health, it's that fundamental nature of all things out of which nature, what we see of nature, arises, that is as close as I can get to the idea of God. I sense that process of creation is ever creating and ever seeking to deliver its own the natural state. It's the wholeness of the natural state into creation. But I think I've mentioned before that ever-creating process meets the kind of disturbance of cause and effect from the past. Or I don't know what, for each individual, is the truth of their portion of that divine nature, but something in them knows. And I think that Harold Klug once, that was in my third year of osteopathic training, he said that he sees that we're working with a patient towards a common goal, which is their well-being. So if I I see myself in that situation as working towards that person's well-being, whatever that well-being may be for them. So making myself available to cooperate with the truth of the truth of their health, the truth of the way the divine nature seeks to manifest itself in them as an individual. So my place is simply to make myself available to cooperating with what is intending to happen within them for their unfoldment and the fulfillment of their potential. And I don't need to know what that is, but I think that what we don't speak of much in the West is what a powerful force consciousness is, and how powerful force intention is. It's coming out in is it Masaru Emoto? You know, the man who looked at how intention
the water?
Speaks to water, and our bodies are water. But I think any time we just seek to cooperate with a person's well-being, then somehow that becomes a kind of a vehicle to support what's natural for that person.
If I were a student, a new osteopathic student, and I were observing you in your clinic, and then on coffee break, or tea break, or chocolate break, you were telling me about the good old days of osteopathy, what would you be telling me?
The good old days of osteopathy?
Mm-hmm.
The good old days are now.
I like that answer.
I mean, I think that we have to look to our roots and our ancestors, but our ancestors wouldn't want us to always be looking back to them unless we were also looking at what is about to be discovered and dug on now, because a tree has roots, but it has leaves and fruit and flowers, and I think we need to draw from our roots, but look what's next, what's seeking to unfold for this moment now.
What do you see that encourages you toward that end, of all the students and the courses and things that you're involved in now?
Well, I know, there are political forces in our profession which we've spoken of, that are tending to kind of limit osteopathy in a reductionist way. But I think that despite that, students are drawn into osteopathic schools, and osteopaths continue to love their work, because once people start doing it, the patient's body teaches each of us. And it doesn't matter about the political forces. They do matter in a way. But what I see what I see around me in the profession is a tremendous kind of enthusiasm and commitment to develop and to develop perception and skill and the ability to listen to the need, that I don't think politics can suppress. And I suppose I do think it's a pity that in the undergraduate training there isn't more space to really explore osteopathic principles in a more direct way. But in fact, if I look back at my undergraduate training, I wasn't really happy. I didn't, there were good people there. I didn't realise how good they were till after I left, and till I found myself acknowledging what had been shared as I worked down the years. I think that, Rollins said it's the patient who's the teacher, and we have to learn from the patient. And I think that goes beyond politics.
Do you think that passion is necessary to be a good osteopath?
Well, I think so, probably, actually. There is something. Old John Wernham used to say, "It never fails to excite me when I feel the vital force returning to the tissues under my fingers." And he called it the vital force. Little John called it the vital force. Some people might call it the breath of life. Sutherland said the purpose of an osteopathic treatment is to effect a more efficient interchange between all tissue interfaces. That feeling of fluid interchange, warmth, life, breathing, connection with, not the connection of the individual field with the field of nature. All those things, when in one way or another, I think most osteopaths stumble upon this feeling of life returning to the tissues, and when that happens, you can but fall in love with it, and it becomes it's almost like a sort of addiction. Well, maybe that's a negative way of saying it, but it's so beautiful to have a direct sensory experience of life, breathing, the living. And I think that's what kind of carries osteopaths forward. And actually, osteopathy's got an amazing number of very old people. Old John Wernham popped his clogs. Was he 99?
I think he was 99, yeah.
And dear Anne Wales, she went into her home, was she 99? She died at 101. But she was teaching us, sort of talking 7 hours on the trot, in her mid-90s. There's something, and then that conference you spoke of, where all Sutherland's pupils were gathered together, and there's a higher proportion of ancient people who are still inspired and active in our profession than in, say, accountancy. So I think there's something that when you work with that feeling of life returning to the tissues, and you engage with it, and you love it, if you work with the breath of life, it works with you too. And that's what I think that's what sustains us, it sustains our colleagues. And
what challenges are you discovering at this time in your life?
In my life or in my profession?
Either.
Probably the same ones. The difficulty of being a human, really. And the strange